everyone. This used to be two lecture theatres. There was the Brown and the Greenwood, and in the middle there was a great technician space where technicians would wheel out all sorts of experiments to demonstrate them to students. Unfortunately, that has gone away. The other feature of this lecture theatre used to be that there was a huge stick, and it was useful for pointing at things, obviously, but it was also useful for sort of intimidating students and keeping them quiet. We don't really have that problem nowadays because everybody's at home watching it online. So anyway, so there's a legal notice, bang. There's the abstract. But I'm going to talk about brain-machine interfaces in humans. I'm going to show you what people are doing around the world, what some of the challenges are to the technology, and then show you what we've been doing at Monash Vision Group for the last 10 years, and lead on to some novel applications, because once you can interface with the visual part of the brain, you can then start to interface with other parts of the brain, and this opens up a number of possibilities. So, brain-machine interfaces. This is not the earliest, but one of the earliest bionic eyes. The earliest just had a photocell and a couple of electrodes, and when someone turned the light on, it would give them a shock to the brain. They would notice that. But Giles Brinly did a lot more because he had around 40 electrodes in someone's head. And I should have brought my mouse, but they had to wear a sort of skull cap, and on this skull cap were lots of radio transmitters attached to some stimulus device, and all of these were all the receivers were placed under the scalp of the person. So they were scalped, lots of receivers put, and then sewn back up again. And the receivers all went to a patch of electrodes on the visual part of the brain, which is generally where you scratch yourself here. I don't know whether that's an important discovery, but that's where the first part of your visual system is in the cortex. And he got the person to point to where they perceived light, and this worked quite well. But they took it out after a year after infection. If you look at this citation here, this is by Jeffrey Rosenfeld and Phil Lewis, who work on our project. There's a good review of all these early works. There was a bit of a renegade. Brindley was a renegade. If you ever look him up on the web, there's a web page about how not to give a lecture, which is quite amusing. DeBell was drummed out of the United States by the FDA and set up a lab in an aeroplane and used to do his surgery in Portugal. And there is actually a person in Melbourne with one of DeBell's implants. He has a connector on his head, and he's had that for about 20 years or more, and he got the electronics put into his brain, or the electrodes put into his brain, but DeBell didn't give him the computer, because a better computer was coming out. Computers were getting smaller and smaller, so he said, just wait, and I'll give you a better computer. But unfortunately, DeBell died, and his wife closed down the company. So there were a number of people with these implants, around 14 or 15. Some have died, and they don't have the computers to go with them or the new batteries to go with them as well. Second Sight, who have a retinal implant that has a couple of hundred people around the world with these retinal implants. They've repurposed their retinal implant to be a cortical implant, and that again uses surface electrodes on the brain. One of the problems there was that the currents have to be quite high to penetrate the brain, and there's a risk of epilepsy in that case. UTAR arrays are used for many experiments, both for recording and stimulating. Control of robotic arms. There's some work going on in the University of Pittsburgh. You can provide sensory feedback. But again, it's sort of gone backwards from what Brinly did. There's a connector. Second sight uses a wireless. So it goes connector, wireless, connector, if you like. So the business end of all bionic eyes are electrodes. And this is one of our electrodes. It's about 1/8 of a millimeter in diameter. It's covered in plastic. It has a region that's ablated away, which exposes the metal. And when you put current into this electrode, the current flows out into the brain. The current produces a voltage drop across any region of the brain. So if you've got a brain cell with its axons, then there will be a voltage drop across the axon, which will cause flow of ions within the axon, and eventually there'll be enough voltage across the membrane that the axon will fire, or the nodes of Ranvier will fire, producing a pulse which may propagate towards another axon via a dendrite. That's deep as I'm going to get into physiology. The difficulty with all these electrodes is a Laplace equation. It basically says, just like heat, electricity spreads out, and the further you get, the less hot it is, the less current there is per square millimeter, so the less voltage drop. And so you can only really excite neurons that are close to this electrode. I'll show you some of our physiological stains to show what happens there. So, worldwide progress. There's a lot on the web, and this is Elon Musk's Neuralink idea, that we start off making brain-machine interfaces, we get better and better bandwidth, so we can replace mobile phones with brain-machine interfaces, and then everybody adopts them, and then there's a huge integration between all your brains and the World Wide Web, and you all become one big thing, and that means there's a reduced risk of anyone thinking anything bad, and therefore everything's bright and rosy in the future. I don't want to say anything bad about Elon Musk because he, infers things about people. However, some of the things that can be true. I don't think smartphones will ever be replaced by brain implants, though it would be cheaper because I wouldn't have to buy my daughters new smartphones every year. Prosthetics with touch sensitivity. Yes, I think that's a sensible thing, that a small amount of feedback from a bionic arm back into the brain is good. Childhood memories reawakened. Probably not a good idea in some cases. Cures for degenerative brain diseases, maybe like transcranial magnetic stimulation, stimulating the brain, albeit in not an incredibly precise sort of neuronal way, could perhaps reboot it into a better state. Add-on processing and memory, probably not. So you won't be able to cheat in your exams using this. Enhanced cognitive function, maybe a little bit of stimulation of the brain sometimes makes it a little bit more exciting and clever. Total interpersonal connectivity via the internet, probably not, and probably not terribly desirable. There's a number of companies funded by DARPA. They want to make soldiers better soldiers and more able to recognize who the enemy is. And paradromics have it looks like a paintbrush, but it isn't. These are micro platinum wires with paraline coating and insulator. And the idea, their main advanced is that they butt these at the other end onto an electronic chip, and so you can get thousands of connections rather than just a few connections. This has sort of fed into some of the Neuralink technologies. Neural dust is quite popular. This is a piezoelectric material that if you squash it, it produces a voltage. So you could perhaps use that to stimulate the brain. And the idea here is that you use ultrasound waves and focus it on little bits of dust as much as you can, and that will generate a voltage which may power a chip, which may have an electrode, which can record as well as stimulate. And by changing the dimensions of this, you probably change its resonant frequency, and therefore the external transmitter looks a little like a radar and can pick up these bits of dust, hopefully, and work out what's going on in the brain, so record some of the activity, but perhaps also stimulate it. Lawrence Livermore are more concentrating on the conventional packaging. Many devices have the electronics sealed up in a package with some feed-throughs. The feed-throughs allow the current to flow, but stop any bodily fluids flowing back into the package, which kills the electronics. So this is DARPA work. This is what Neuralink, funded by Elon Musk and others, have actually come up with. And it's basically a huge sewing machine. And it can sew almost 3,000 electrodes. And it has a little hook. And the electrode, it drags the electrode wire down. And then the hook disappears and puts all these things into usually a rat's brain. And they've demonstrated that they can record off the brain here. And you can put in electrodes very quickly, in fractions of a second, so the whole operation doesn't take so long. Rather than me saying anything bad about Elon Musk, I've cited someone else, which I think is a safer thing to do. What they haven't really got is a wireless system. So the system at the moment is 23 by 28 millimeters, about that big. So it's quite large to fit under the skull. It has a connector, like a miniature USB connection to the outside world. And some of the channels interfere with one another. But it's got the highest electrode count of anyone at the moment. This is more a Melbourne invention, and Tom Oxley can talk about it. A lot of operations on the heart are now done through the wrist or through the groin, and you can do quite sophisticated things, put in new heart valves very easily with day procedures. So putting electrodes into the brain, particularly the center of the brain, could be done in a similar way, and this is the stentrode idea, that you push this thing through, it's in a small form as you're pushing it, and then you put it close to the bit of the brain that you want to monitor, and it has various electrode sites on it, and then it opens up and presses against the side of the blood vessel, which is close to the neurons. There's a neural grain. I don't know whether this has been thought through so much. This is more wireless powered, and I'll talk about some of the problems with that later. There's a company called Kernel. If you look at their website, they say they've got an 80% success rate of retrieving memories from the brain, which sounds amazing. It's much better than I am. But I suppose if you say it's any memory, then that might be okay. So I'm not quite believing in that. So there's a lot of difficulties with going into the brain. It's not just plugging a USB into a computer or connecting up an optical fiber. You're always somewhat fighting the physiology, and you're limited by the physics. For example, this is one of Elon Musk's earlier concepts, which was a sort of fishing net that goes into the brain. And I think this comes from the concept that if you look at magazine covers, they always have brain cells like jellyfish in water. And there's sort of one over here and one over here. So if you put this net into the brain, the jellyfish will get caught on it, and the net can be made out of conductive wire, and you can communicate back to the outside. But brain isn't like that. It's more like butter or spaghetti bolognese or something like that. So it's difficult to cast a net into it. One of the issues with any electronics is you've got to provide power, and the way we do it is a little coil of wire here. And Faraday, many, many years ago, said that the bigger the coil of wire, the area, the more magnetic field will go through it, and the more magnetic field that goes through it, the more voltage you get. And this, I think, is a problem with when you get to neural dust, that you put into the brain such a small coil, these are the electrically powered ones, that you can't really get much power into them to do much stimulation. Maybe you can use optical power, like optical fibers. Optogenetics is very interesting like that. But again, if you shone a laser into the brain, it isn't a beam anymore. It scatters a lot. One of the great issues is heating of electronics. When you put power into it, it has to go somewhere, and it usually ends up as heat. And you don't want to heat up the brain by more than 1.5 degrees. So that sort of limits the density of electronics that you can put into the brain. There's also a lot of information in the brain, and many spiking events communicating from one neuron to another neuron. And the question is, how do you get all this information out? It's really very difficult to measure just a few electrodes measuring spikes on neurons. But considering that you've got 70 billion neurons, that's quite a lot of information. It's up at the end of the best optical fibers, with great racks of equipment at the end of them. Device resolution. Now, we've seen the sort of sewing machine idea, and when you look at that paper, the threads are put in fairly spaced apart, because there's a mechanical problem that every time you put something into the brain, you tend to be pushing the neurons away. And this particular picture is of a part of a brain, animal brain, a sheep actually, where we put electrodes in, and it's pushed neurons away from the electrode sites. So we've had to design the electrodes to be powerful enough to cope with that. Then the blue ones are the glial reaction to the electrode. So the brain goes, hang on, that's not part of me. I will do an immune response against it. So that's an issue, though not overcomable. And then there's the whole point of, if you want to recover a particular piece of information from the brain, you need to know how to decode it. And people know which part of the brain deals with audio and sensory and vision, but decoding, if you ask me, well, how would you find what color something was that the eye was seeing by monitoring a particular neuron? I think most people would be hard tasked to answer that question. So once you've got the information, how do you actually understand it? One of the biggest things, though, is ethics. When you access the brain, you usually require invasive procedures. It might be through a small burr hole where you inject neural dust or whatever, usually a craniotomy to put larger electronics in. And so there's a balance between the risks of brain surgery and the restoration of some sight. And the people who are receiving this are perfectly well. It's not as though they have stage 4 horrible disease. They're hopefully going to last for many, many tens of years. So Maynard wrote a paper. There are, I think, more people working on the ethics than there are working on the actual devices, and more conferences about the ethics. But people are very worried that we will be able to read people's minds, and I can assure you that's really not going to happen. But there are so many people worried about the ethics, it's somewhat slowing down the business of moving forward with the technology. So what have we done at Monash Vision Group? This is a nice compelling picture. It says if you have one of our transmitters on the back of your head and you have these tiles in your brain, then you'll be able to get on the metro system and go to work. And you say that's compelling. Well, it's compelling to the government because the more people that work, the more people pay taxes. But you can also have a nice coffee as well. So we've been developing these tiles over the last 10 years. They're electronic packages with 500,000 transistors in them. They've got 43 electrodes. They plug into the brain. Each has a receiving coil. They've all got different addresses, so you can send them different information and stimulate what are called phosphenes on the brain, which are little dots of light. And we've sort of represented this that if someone's looking at it, there's a camera on the glasses. There's a processor which turns this into a data signal. It goes into the tile. The tile then makes the brain perceive that it's seen some light. There's only 43 electrodes per tile, so we have some clever software engineers that can make these very sensible and, for example, have emoticons to represent people saying hello, or have pictures of the exit. So if things are going wrong in a lecture, you have a path of light, rather like the aircraft lights they tell you about, and you can use these electrodes more sensibly. We're about here with 4 tiles, 500 pixels, if you like, with 12 tiles, and Neuralink, Neuralink are up here, perhaps, and DARPA wants to be at 1 million electrodes. We're also doing recording tiles, and this is part of the CIBF, Center for Integrative Brain Function, and we can record spikes from these tiles, but they're also compatible with our stimulation tiles. So the big vision picture is you could take the whole of the brain, or at least the whole of the surface of the brain, and implant recording or stimulating tiles onto various parts. We want bionic vision in the visual cortex here, but we could go into parts associated with reading, speech, sensory, for picking up senses, not breaking eggs when you pick them up as the usual example, and the motor cortex for driving external limbs. But there might be other places that you can go, unknown frontiers, if you like, which could address more subtle aspects of what the brain's doing. So, conclusions. Brain-machine interfaces have been around a long, long time. Brinly, good to look him up. There are many projects around the world, particularly in the last 10 years. Many are at an early stage, so what you see is more the work of a graphic artist than a real thing. There's bounds on physics and physiology when you interface with the brain. Engineering tries to get to those bounds but can never get past them. We have developed little tiles that can be plugged into the brain, initially for vision, but could be anywhere. And this leads us to many opportunities. We have the base technology, the core technology of being able to put sophisticated electronics into the head and communicate with it to the outside world. So this certainly gives us a very interesting future of these technologies, and there are many groups in Australia who are leading the way in bionics, and of course everyone is inspired by Graham Clark and his team's work on auditory sense restoration, and that's always a big thing. That it's why Kevin Rudd put 52 million into this project around 10 years ago, and why we still get funding from our benefactors, including research agencies and private people, to continue this exciting work into the future.
Yeah, thanks everyone. I'm going to pick up on a few things that Arthur mentioned, but I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the history of bionics and then some of the work that we're currently doing at the Bionics Institute in Melbourne. All right, but to define what medical bionics is, essentially I'm going to talk about devices that use electric currents to treat health conditions, and particularly implanted electronic devices. And as I said, I'll talk a bit about some devices that we have now and what's coming up. And to be specific, I won't be talking about devices that use magnetic fields or devices that Arthur has talked a bit about that are really around recording or monitoring electric signals in the brain. So it all started a long time ago with electric rays, which are not something out of science fiction, but I'm talking about these, which are fish that generate electric currents. And some 2,000 years ago, the ancient Romans used them to alleviate pain, treat headaches, and even treat gout. And you might know that there are electric eels that also pack quite a bit of charge, and apparently these were used occasionally to relieve pain, well, replace perhaps one pain with another pain, and improve blood circulation. Now we're going to jump forward to 1800, where Volta invented the battery. And a battery, of course, is not much more than two different types of metal immersed in an electrolyte. But the important point here is that now people could actually generate electric currents without relying on things like those fish that you just saw. So it opened up a whole new field of experimentation. And incidentally, Volta was the first person, we think, to electrically stimulate the auditory nerve. He connected up a battery which we think generated about 100 volts. He put an electrode in each ear, and he described the result as being like a bang on the head followed by the sound of a bubbling fluid. Probably a very accurate description. I think we've touched on Michael Faraday, and the reason that this is an important milestone, I think, is because it leads to devices like this, which actually found in the Medical Museum at this university, which is typical of many that were made at the time. It's called a magnetoelectric machine for nervous diseases, but in fact, if you look at the indications, it can be used to treat practically any kind of ill health you can possibly imagine. And if you look at the box there, which is very nicely made, it's got a horseshoe magnet, that's the blue bit at the back there, and it also has a crank, nice brass cogs and things, a crank that you would stick in the front here. You plug these electrodes, you turn the handle, and it generates a current that can be used to cure ill health somehow. But when we get to the 20th century, things really changed because there was the emergence of scientific evidence underpinning medical therapies. And in particular, the transistor, the invention of the transistor was really crucial to take this technology forward, because transistors operate on voltages and currents that are pretty compatible with what neurons naturally produce or respond to. And that's quite different from the devices that we've seen in the last few slides. And furthermore, integrated circuits with many transistors started to appear in the 1960s. Means you can make a very complex but still reliable circuit in a tiny package, and that of course is very suitable for implantation in the body. In the 1950s, the first devices that we think of as being true medical bionic devices emerged, and this one is interesting because it's probably the first version of a cochlear implant. The text below says that this happened in 1953, and the title says it's about electrically stimulating the cochlear nerve in humans using a fully implanted coil, and it's inductively coupled by the coils to a microphone and an amplifier outside the person's head. And this was actually used in a couple of patients, and it did produce useful hearing sensations. So it goes back quite a way. Also in the 1950s, there were quite a few mavericks who came onto the scene, Giles Brinly being one, who I agree is a very interesting person. Jose Delgado, a Spanish scientist who also worked in America, used an electrode that, well, a lot of these devices were electrical stimulation to treat psychiatric conditions. And he thought that you could possibly eliminate or reduce things like aggression in people. And you see him holding here an implantable stimulator, and on the other hand is a radio transmitter, so he could control that stimulation from a distance away from the brain implant. And being Spanish, he knew a bit about bulls, and he actually did experiments with an electrical stimulator implanted in a bull's brain. This is him here as a much younger man who lived to tell the tale, and he's holding a transmitter and he's electrically stimulating remotely something in the bull's brain that screeches to a halt just before it gores him. This is true, I'm not making this up. But the person in the background there wasn't quite so convinced, I guess. In 1958, cardiac pacemakers came along, and this is a very simple circuit with a couple of transistors and a battery in it. But we really need to think about too, as some of the questions came up about patients who actually agreed to have these unusual treatments for the first time. This person, Arne Larsson, he had 26 different pacemakers implanted, and that was because the devices failed. The early devices were not always very reliable, or because the technology improved and gave a better outcome. But he lived to be 86. He outlived the person who invented this first device and the surgeon who implanted it. We'll skip over Giles Brinly, I think, because we've already heard about him. Then we fast forward a bit to 1978, where the University of Melbourne Cochlea Implant was first put into a patient. That is the first patient on the right-hand side there, listening to his wife speaking. You can see the implant itself is fairly big and actually quite thick as well, but in particular the sound processor, which the patient had to carry around, was very bulky and not very convenient to use. But still, it was tested in 3 patients. It gave really good results, and the rest is history, as they say. In the 1990s, deep brain stimulation began to be widely accepted, and this is an absolutely fantastic treatment which alleviates some of the symptoms of Parkinson's disease and other movement disorders. It can be used in epilepsy and other conditions. This is probably the most successful brain stimulation technology that's currently in widespread use. So in the picture you can see it has a stimulator that's implanted in the chest. It has wires that run up underneath the skin of the neck, and then it has usually 2 electrodes, one in each hemisphere of the brain. And this is an X-ray of a patient in Melbourne. You can see that the electrodes they really are deep. It's not called deep for nothing. So the surgeons have to pass these electrodes down through the holes drilled into the skull and somehow get the electrodes to exactly the right place to get the best therapy with this device. And the other things you can see are the wires that go down to the stimulator. These are just connectors on the lead wires. So now I'm going to talk quickly about some of the R&D that we're currently doing at the Bionics Institute, just 15 minutes walk away from where we are today in East Melbourne. And we've got a lot of different projects running. They're about vision impairment. We still work on hearing impairment and improving cochlear implants. We're working on deep brain stimulation for Parkinson's disease. We have projects that are about monitoring epileptic seizures and treating inflammatory bowel disease and others. But without going into too much detail in the limited time that I've got, I'm just going to talk very briefly about these 3 main projects. So I think you know a bit about what a Bionic Eye is. Our device is a little bit different from what Arthur talked about because it's got electrodes that are actually in the eye and they stimulate the retinal cells in a person who's lost their vision, generally through retinitis pigmentosa, which is an inherited condition causing progressive loss of vision. So if you zoom into an eye that has a cross-section shown here, our electrodes are positioned somewhat distantly from the ganglion cells in the retina that we want to stimulate, but we've chosen this location because it's very safe. It's easy for the surgeons to get the electrodes in there, and it's still close enough to those retinal cells to create vision sensations. And there's an electrode array that was used in the first group of patients that was developed in the Bionics Institute. So as you probably know, we've already done a clinical trial with 3 people who had retinitis pigmentosa, or who have it, and these are the 3 people here doing different things. The electrodes were accessed via the connector that you saw in that previous slide, so wasn't really suitable for permanent use, but it did give people some ability to navigate, walk around the street, to locate items on shelves, and in this case this is doing an in the laboratory type of test to pick up the shape or the position of different objects. So we've moved on now to a second generation of device which is intended for permanent use, and we have 4 patients who've had this since the trial commenced in 2018. This is very much what the device looks like. It has a vision processor that's small enough to carry in a pocket or on a belt. It has a camera on the glasses, and it has stimulators that are implanted underneath the scalp. This is going really well. I can't tell you all the results of the trial because we're only about halfway through it, but the results are really very impressive. I think these people are able to localise objects. They can walk through, say, a corridor or down a street and avoid obstacles that they might otherwise have tripped over, and they report that they feel more connected with the community because they can find their way around a shopping centre, or they can avoid embarrassing themselves by not recognising objects. But still fairly crude vision, a bit like Arthur said. It's not, no one's going to read a book with this, but it is very useful for people who don't have any other useful vision. Okay, so moving on, I just want to talk quickly about the current trends in this field and how we're improving these devices. And here I've listed some of the main things that are currently still a problem. One is which device is most appropriate for each individual with a given type of ill health or disability. For example, a person who's deaf, are they deaf enough to need a cochlear implant, or is their hearing impairment something you could deal with using an acoustic hearing aid? We also want to help clinicians to get the device implanted safely and with the best possible outcomes. And we want to optimise the pattern of stimulation that we use because that maximises the benefit and avoids side effects. And I'm going to only talk about 2 of our projects, which are to do with hearing and Parkinson's disease. But to start off with the cochlear implant and its use in hearing to restore some hearing, and how to optimise stimulation parameters for the cochlear implant. So here's a fairly recent version of the commercial cochlear implant that's sold by Cochlea. Instead of that big bulky sound processor you saw earlier, all of the sound processing now fits on the ear and looks rather like a hearing aid. The implant is much smaller and thinner and fits easily under the scalp, and in the cross section you can see multiple electrodes placed in the cochlea. So the principles haven't changed much, but the technology has definitely improved a lot. And about 500,000 people around the world now have one type or another of a cochlear implant, and the most recent versions that you can see here are quite discreet and a lot more kind of cosmetically acceptable than earlier versions. But a lot of people who need a cochlear implant are children who are born deaf, and they pose a particular problem because there's an important aspect of any of these devices, which is that you don't just pop it in surgically and then say goodbye to the patient and everything's fine. The surgery is actually probably the smallest part of the task. Once you've got the device in the patient, you then have to adjust stimulation parameters to get the best possible performance and to avoid unwanted side effects. And that requires a lot of time, requires a lot of interaction between a clinician and each patient, and it requires many visits of the patient back to see a clinician who specialises in that task. And sometimes that is overlooked. I think people concentrate too much on the technology and the surgery, but it's this follow-up period that's probably critical, most critical, to getting a good result. Now, if you've got an adult who's deaf and they need a cochlear implant, they can tell you what they hear. But very young children definitely don't have that ability. So there's a lot of problems in fitting, say, babies, and there are babies less than 6 months of age who are getting cochlear implants now. And those are some of the questions that we need to address in these cases. But the most important one probably is, how do you know that that infant is actually hearing something with the cochlear implant? And how do you adjust the settings so that the hearing is correct or optimised for that individual? There's a lot of variation between individuals, so it's a difficult problem. They can't tell you what they're hearing. So we're developing a device like this that is based on brain imaging, and it looks a bit scary perhaps, but actually it's completely safe. It's a cap that has optical light sources and sensors in it, and it shines lights through the skull. The brain picks up that light and reflects or refracts some of it, and there are sensors that pick up the refracted light coming back out again. And what that's indicating is activity in the brain. So when parts of your brain are active for some reason, they use up more oxygen from the blood, changes the qualities of the blood, and this kind of optical imaging can pick up those changes. It's completely safe, it's non-invasive, and it's silent, which is really important for fitting hearing devices. It's actually quite convenient. You can imagine a small device that does this, and it's much less expensive than other techniques like magnetic resonance imaging, for example. So we actually have a system like this under construction, and we hope to commercialise it soon. And what we're showing in this is that there's an array of these optodes or optical detectors over the auditory parts of the brain. These diagrams show where they are. And these are called regions of interest. That's the ROI that you can see there. And each of those 6 sites is picking up some activity in 6 locations in the auditory part of the brain. And what it's showing is that the different colours here are different levels of stimulation. So the green is a very soft sound, the red is a very intense, loud sound. And if you look at this particular region here, you can definitely see an increase in the activity that's related to that stimulus. So without requiring any conscious interaction with an infant, or with an adult for that matter, you can say, yes, they're hearing a sound and it's such and such a loudness. And this is crucial for being able to get the right settings in a cochlear implant or a hearing aid in the case where you can't get a behavioural response. So we're well on the way to commercialising this system. Okay, and then finally I'm going to talk briefly about treating Parkinson's disease using deep brain stimulation. And this is two factors are important here. One is helping the surgeons to get the device to the right place in the brain, and the other is again optimising stimulation settings. Parkinson's disease is unfortunately very common. There's about 10 million people around the world living with Parkinson's, and there are many treatments, but they're not all terribly effective. Deep brain stimulation can suppress the movement disorders that are very disabling for a lot of people with Parkinson's. And there's something like 150,000 people using deep brain stimulation around the world at the moment. There's no suggestion it's not safe. It's well tolerated. The number of people getting DBS is increasing rapidly. But there are still some problems though. One is that the electrodes have to be got to the right target in the brain within a millimetre or 2. And that's a really, really difficult problem. And the other one again is getting the stimulation correct. So we have developed a technique now that we think is going to help with this. It's a bit like radar, where you send out electric pulses from the electrodes as they go into the brain, and you monitor a signal that's generated back by the neurons in the brain from that electric stimulation. So again, notice you're going down to a point which is kind of like a line between your ears and a line through your nose, and the surgeon has to get it to that right spot within a millimetre or 2, and they can't kind of mess around with the patient's brain, so they need to get it right the first time. We think this is working very well, and here's a simple example of it. This is an X-ray. It's a section through part of a patient's brain with these electrodes. And on the left, this is highly magnified, right? This is a very small part of the brain. These electrodes here are only about 1 millimetre in diameter. So this particular electrode is not generating much of a response that you see down the bottom here because it's not ideally placed and it won't give the best benefit. But in the other hemisphere, in the same patient, this electrode is actually generating a big response, and that corresponds to having the electrode in the right place. But you can kind of tell from those two X-ray slices in the same patient that there's not much difference in the position of those electrodes. So we think this could make a huge improvement to the way surgeons get the electrodes to the right spot. We're also going to use the same method, and we're again well advanced on this already, to kind of what we would call a cruise control for DBS. And the background to this is that deep brain stimulation is on 24/7. It's just constant stimulation once the device is implanted. And that's not ideal because Parkinson's disease continually fluctuates in minutes or hours, over days, weeks, months, and that's all superimposed on a progressive decline over years. So these sorts of things are very troubling to patients because now they might feel all right, but in an hour's time they've got tremors and muscle rigidity and so forth, but the DBS is exactly the same in both cases. So what we're doing is we're measuring brain activity from those same DBS electrodes, finding out from the signals that we measure what the symptoms are that the patient is experiencing at the moment, and then adjusting the settings and changing the way the stimulation operates so as to adapt to changes in the patient's condition. And again, this is well advanced. We've done quite a few trials on this, and we're well on the pathway to commercialising this system. We're going to build the commercial version on this prototype, which we're in the process of acquiring as we speak. So it has an implantable pulse generator like the one you saw in the earlier picture. We're going to modify the software in that to do what we want. And there's a remote control, a charging device for the patient to recharge the battery in the implant, and a programming unit which is used by the clinician to set up the individual parameters for each patient. So again, this is well advanced. We expect this to be in trials in patients within 2 years. And we've already done studies in showing the data that this is built on. We've done studies in 100 and something patients, nearly 150 patients with DBS in Parkinson's disease. All of that's done around hospitals in Melbourne. Okay, so I'm going to leave it on that positive note and say that electric stimulation is a really good area to be in if you're interested in applying your research to help people who have ill health. And it's rapidly growing. It's much more kind of cost effective than developing new drugs, for example. Deep brain stimulation has huge possibilities. It's being used in trials in many different parts of the world to treat a whole range of different disorders, including Alzheimer's and addictions, stroke and brain injury. But where the improvements will happen from an engineering perspective is making devices that are less invasive, have better stimulation techniques, and it's all personalised. So each setting, each individual patient gets their own setting, and we want to make that as automatic as possible to improve people's outcomes. So thank you for listening, and I shall leave it there.